My name is Jennifer Domain.
Nicholas Galendez.
And we're associate attorneys with the Cannabis Legal Group. We're talking to you today about employee handbooks and why they are so important for your facility, not only during the inspection process, the build out, but also just moving forward with your business and protecting your business in your relationship with your employees. But before we dive into that, let's talk about the news.
So today in this week's news, we have a little bit of a sneak peek for new bills that are proposed in Nevada. We're also talking about a recent court case that came aboard involving caregivers and municipality. And we're also going to discuss a little bit about the potential crackdown on the black market that was recently reported by some news outlets. So first, just a little tidbit from the state of Nevada. They recently proposed a bill that would change the decision-making power for issuing licenses there from the taxation department to a 5-member board that is appointed by the governor. It's very interesting to see, as you know, in Michigan, we translated from a licensing board to now the Marijuana Regulatory Agency, which is issuing decisions. So obviously each state's different, and they're going to have their own reasons for doing so, but it's just interesting seeing the criticisms and complaints that were happening from the licensing board here in Michigan going away from that, whereas Nevada is actually changing things around, going from a department review and approval to a 5-person licensing board. So to be seen how things shake up there and if that makes the process there more efficient. What we've seen here from the Marijuana Regulatory Agency, though, is now, without having a licensing board meeting every month, they are rolling through decisions a bit faster, so we applaud the agency for doing that. The second bit of news is regarding caregiver conduct in municipalities. There was a court case, City of Warren versus Bezzy, which involved basically, this has been one of the questions that has plagued the MMMA and caregiver conduct versus municipalities for years. But basically, the question is, how much can a city enforce its policies, its ordinances against caregiver conduct? The particular city in question issued 3 ordinance violations for failure to have a safety inspection, for noxious odors and nuisances, and also for operating a business in violation of the law. What this Court of Appeals held was that the city's ordinance was preempted by the MMMA, meaning that all of these regulations that touched on the caregivers' medical use of marijuana and cultivation did not apply, therefore they couldn't give ordinance violations just for engaging in what state law allows you to do. There's another case pending before our Supreme Court, DeRuyter versus Byron Township, and finally, it hasn't been scheduled for a court decision yet, but as soon as we have that, there will be definite, more final guidance on that question. Then finally, just wanted to mention the potential crackdown on the black market in Michigan. There's been a few news outlets that have reported that the Marijuana and Tobacco Investigation Section, which right now does background checks for the Marijuana Regulatory Agency, is also going to be working with local law enforcement and prosecutors to crack down on the alleged black market operations that are going on in Michigan. There's been word about delivery services, gifting, certain conduct by unlicensed companies and individuals that have kind of been a little bit buzzworthy lately. So this is just an additional piece that we are going to see how that plays out.
So that's basically the news in a nutshell, and we'll just dive into talking about the employee handbooks. So the first thing that we need to recognize about employee handbooks is that it is required under Rule 81 2D of the administrative rules. So this specific rule explicitly states that a licensee shall comply with all the following. You need to train your employees and have an employee training manual that includes various items for safety procedures for your employees, guidelines, security protocol, etc. So it explicitly outlines certain things that you need to put in this training manual, and they expect you to have this on site. We've had several clients, I believe, that have gone through inspections, and they have not only asked to see this, but then reviewed it to make sure that it complies with this rule, correct, Nick?
Yeah, the facility inspections that I've been on, granted the first one, this rule says you have to train your employees and have the training manual to teach them these specific things. What it doesn't say is that throughout the inspection, you need to provide them with that actual employee training manual. So through trial and error, we've found out that not only does the staffing plan have to be submitted for step 2, the facility license application, outlining all of these procedures and including these, how you're going to train your employees and that you will have a training manual, but that the actual enforcement regulators, when they do come and inspect your facility, will ask you, show me a copy of the employee training manual. And we know they do this too with, show us your check-in, your visitor check-in log, show us background checks that you've ran on certain employees. So this is just kind of another aspect in terms of regulatory compliance that you need to have in mind with having that on hand, actually implementing these procedures to make sure that you fully comply with all the rules and regulations.
So just to back up, you mentioned that it's slightly different from your staffing plan. So can you just present your staffing plan to the inspectors, or will they be looking for additional things on top of that?
Well, we tried. And so in a little scramble during that inspection, I said, well, I know that we talked about this. I know that our staffing plans here at CLG have employment policies and a lot of stuff we're going to talk about in a few minutes. And so I pointed to that specific section in the staffing plan saying, employee training, here's X, Y, and Z. And they still said, no, we actually need to see the physical manual that you will be giving to each employee that you hire. So I think there's a little bit of difference in naming staffing plan, employee handbook, employee training manuals. It all comes down to what the audience is. The staffing plan is obviously going to be one of the many narratives that you're going to submit to the state with your facility license application. But as far as the employee training manual / handbook, that's actually geared toward the individuals who you're going to be working and employing at your facility. So a lot of them are going to have similar, address similar topics, but it's just a matter of who it's tailored to. The staffing plan is obviously going to make sure to hit all of those rules and regulations, can even have citations to the rule and the law in it, just to make it very clear to the regulators that we're checking and meeting and exceeding all of these boxes. The training manual can be a little bit more informal, but should still be serious and definitely convey a lot of things that we'll be talking about to the actual individuals who will be responsible for keeping your company running, who you'll be paying, who you'll be disciplining, potentially firing, and so on and so forth. So.
Right. So it sounds like the theme between, or the difference between these two documents is tone. Tone in how you structure it, tone in how you describe the employee relationship between the employee and the employer, correct? Okay, so just to give a broad overview of what you need in an employee handbook, we're going to go over a bunch of items and they're going to be very broad. We're not going to go into specifics. If you have specific questions, feel free to shoot them in the comments, but generally speaking, there are certain provisions that you need to put into your employee handbook that'll really set expectations for your employees. And if you have guidelines, then your employees are more likely to meet your expectations. You're more likely to have a successful outcome and just grow in your company. And the regulators are going to know where to look to ensure that your employees have been properly trained or have been provided guidelines on how to do something in compliance with their rules. So just generally with any employment handbook, you're going to want the big picture items. So you'll want to say things like, is this an at-will employment agreement? If you have a bunch of employees and they're all at will, you can specifically say that they're at will, or you can just leave it blank. And as Michigan is an at-will employment state, the courts would interpret that as being an at-will arrangement. So we always suggest that more specific is better. So you definitely want to consider putting in that this is an at-will relationship unless you have specific contract employees. The other big things would be mentioning compliance with certain laws. So for instance, we have major federal laws that are very important to maintain compliance with, like the Americans with Disability Act and the Equal Employment Opportunity Act. Items like these say that you're not going to discriminate against individuals who fall into certain classes. So you're not going to discriminate in your hiring practices, your firing practices, based on their gender, their disability, their age, their race, etc. It's very, very important that you have these statements in there, or else you might be considered making a discretionary decision without a valid basis, and they could file a claim with the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and you'll be investigated. We want to avoid as many of these claims as possible, so having a very clear statement in your employee handbook is crucial.
And I also think too, just to go back to the difference in audience and tone, the staffing plan, so to speak, is going to be you showing the regulators and the state authorities and the local municipal authorities that you can comply with all the rules. The employee training manual and handbook, so to speak, is more like your playbook. You're going to tell the employees who will be working for you exactly how to open and close the facility, what your vacation time policies are, your anti-discrimination policies, your compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. You kind of show them your hands so that, when they're coming in as new employees, they don't know how your facilities run, they don't know the security protocols, they don't know the safety training procedures that you're having all your employees go through. So while you'll be training them when they come in for orientation and as they continue employment, they're going to forget things, as all humans do. And so what you want to do to protect yourself as well is just have it in writing. You're going to want to have them sign it. You're going to want to make sure that they have read and understood everything that they're going to be held to as an employee and you as the employer. So I think that's, this is kind of the guidebook, the playbook for every employee that's going to be working for your facility as to how it's run, all the things and rules that they're going to have to follow.
I would agree with that. So just like Nick said, a couple of other items that you want to make sure that you really hammer home in this document. We've talked about anti-discrimination policies. We've talked about keeping compliance with the EEOC and ADA. Make sure you list your hours of work. Make sure you list your payroll practices. This way you can refer to that in case there's an issue. Anti-harassment or anti-discrimination. We're in an era of a Me Too movement. You have to have something like that in there. Attendance, discipline, dress code, and safety. All of these seem very basic, but think about it. You're a cannabis facility and you might be in a lab, or you might be in a grow room where you have to have a clean outfit, or you might have to go through a clean room and put on new clothing. So, by having a dress code and stating, no open-toed shoes, or, you can't have certain items of clothing on, that sort of thing needs to be put into your employee handbook. This way you can point to it in case the regulators say, there was this problem. Did you address this? Did you mention that this would be a problem? You can point directly to your employee handbook and say, listen, I'm sorry, we took care of the issue with the employee. It's not going to be a problem anymore, but it was addressed in our employee handbook at the beginning. So the burden, the issue should not be a reflection on the company's policies, but rather on the bad actions of one employee. So you can protect yourself there. Other minor issues that you definitely want to throw in would just be, if your employees are going to have time off, outline what time off they have. Outline their sick days, their holidays, if they're going to have any sort of maternity leave, anything like that. Just protect yourself. And then, of course, put in the cannabis-specific stuff that Nick was talking about. Employee safety procedures. If you're a processing plant, or if you are a safety compliance center, you are going to be dealing with some big machinery. You're going to be dealing with some machinery that is possibly dangerous or requires OSHA certifications. So make sure you put that stuff into your employee handbook, as well as any educational training materials that they will need to reference, any standard operating procedures that they should be following. This way it's all there in one spot. And once you give it to them, like you said, have them sign it. Make sure that you retain a copy of that signature. This way, in case there's a dispute, I didn't know that that would be an issue. You can pull out that signature and say, listen, on such and such date, you signed this saying I gave it to you. You know, you had been told beforehand, and even though you maybe forgot about it or didn't remember it, our company provided you with that information. So that protects your company and it protects your license.
And that's the important thing too, in terms of having the policy written out. A lot of the questions that we've been getting from callers and just people curious about how the new law affects their ability on the workplace. They ask, how can they test me for cannabis in my system when it's legal? And just as a reminder, the Facility Licensing Act for medical marijuana and the Prop 1, the MRTMA for adult use, does not touch private employment. So what it does is defers to them. It says, okay, employers, you can set a policy for all of your employees. Whether that's don't get high on the job, you can't test positive at all for cannabis in your system, that should be written out regardless. But really what the law says is that employers can do what they want and set that policy, but as an employer, you want to for sure have that in writing.
Right.
Otherwise, it turns into a he said, she said issue. There's a lot of more potential for liability and risk if you're doing it that way. To also talk about the other point you made about cannabis-specific educational training, not everyone who's going to come work for your facility is going to be a cannabis guru. So, as far as product information, dosage, how to interact with patients and caregivers in terms of what kind of product, topical, suppositories, lotions, tinctures, cartridges, flowers, sativa, indica, hybrid, they're going to need to be educated and trained so that they can properly train the customers that do come in and advise them. Being those patient consultations, they're going to need to know that type of information in order to relay that properly. So it's really important to have all of that lined out and really have continuing training for them. We're in a new industry, so a lot of different products are still being made and different variations of them do a lot of different things depending on the concentration of CBD, THC, and all of the other different variants that comes from the cannabis plant. So in addition to having cannabis-specific training in your handbook, you're going to also want to make sure that your staff, especially for a provisioning center or retail establishment, is going to be up to date on the newest kind of trends and the newest products as you go along, and making sure to get their signature in writing.
Right. So the bottom line is that not only is this document going to be required at an inspection, but it's also going to do everything to set the expectations with your employees and also protect your company in the long run from litigation, from investigations by the EEOC. We're going to try to create a document that will protect you from any possible issue with your employees. And as long as you can show that you provided the information required by the law and the educational materials that your employees will need to know, and you retain a copy of a signature saying that your employees had read and reviewed it and have retained a copy of it, you should be in good shape. So those are just general, really quick overviews of what you need, but it's certainly worth a conversation with a law firm or with your business partners to workshop a good copy of this document. So if you have any questions on what a good copy would look like, or if you have questions on whether yours would meet the standards required by the state, set up a consultation, drop a comment in our comment box down below, and we'll look forward to talking with you next week.
And if you're a potential or a current employee, there's also the other side of the coin. And I think, in the future we'll be doing some shows on certain violations that employers might, be, incorrect to violate.
Oh, right.
Kind of from the employee side of things, just certain rights from there. So definitely kind of, full spectrum coming in with all the different angles from both the employers and employee side. But until then, we'll see you next week. From Cannabis Legal Group, I'm Nick Melendez.
And Jennifer Domain.
Have a good weekend.